talk,
identity,
and access
management.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast, episode number 27. If identity and access management is your jam, then you've come to the right place. It's a new year. We got a new intro. It's a new us, maybe new you too. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Whoop, whoop. Here I am.
What was that?
That was the celebration of the new intro, and this being my jam, I figured I'd throw a little bit of hip hop in there.
All right.
No,
IAM is your jam.
Yeah, definitely not hip hop, right?
We'll leave that out for folks to decide.
All right.
So we took a little bit of break over the holiday season. I think a well-earned break for us, but we're back. Going to start a new weekly streak of content, I hope. We're also going to try something new, and we used to publish on Fridays, and we're going to try and publish now on Mondays and see how that works, and see if that makes it easier for folks to kind of keep up with the content we're pushing out. Our previous record was, I think, 26 episodes since July of last year up through December. So we'll see how it goes this year before we have to take another break, or decide to take another break, because we can do that.
Yeah, I would say I got to give you credit, Jeff. I mean, you've been talking about this for years. Then beginning of this year, or beginning of last year, 19, we said, all right, let's actually do it. And we did it. I mean, 29 episodes is a pretty big accomplishment, I think. And I'm looking forward to 2020. I want to top that number of episodes this year for sure. I want to stay on a weekly basis. And I'm hopefully, increase the number of people who are getting value from this podcast. And I'm really looking forward to this year. I'm a pretty positive person. I put a positive spin on everything. But I feel like this is going to be a year where we have an opportunity to, achieve a lot of our goals.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a good kind of let's start off strong. I know we got a couple topics we're going to talk about today. The first one we're going to talk about is what makes a good IAM program manager. And then we'll talk maybe about some mistakes that we've made in our IAM careers and what we see other companies making from an IAM perspective, mistake-wise, down a little bit after that. But why don't we start with what makes a good IAM program manager? What are your thoughts?
Well, and I think we're qualified to talk about this because we've both done this at some pretty big companies, and typically with the engagements we do with Identity, our counterpart at the company is the program manager. And I feel like an IAM program manager has to be somebody who's well-rounded. This has kind of been my perspective for a long time. Maybe it's my bias because I kind of think of myself as a well-rounded person, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 50-50 having IAM knowledge and not IAM, or knowledge or experience in areas other than IAM. That doesn't mean if you haven't spent 50% of your career in IAM, that you can't be a good IAM program manager. But I do think you have to have some understanding of the space. And if you don't, and you find yourself thrust into that role, I really feel like it behooves you to go out and, research and, go to conferences, spend time watching YouTubes, reading white papers, networking with people who are in the space, and starting to get an understanding. When I first got into IAM, it was a pretty small industry. I started in IAM in 2003. I got into IAM. I was like, this is actually a space. I'd never heard of it before. So I was one of those people who was, kind of thrust into an IAM program manager kind of role, and I did not have the background. And, I was pretty early in my career too, so I didn't really have all the skills, and you kind of have to learn on the fly and kind of, have the right personality. I think personality is a big thing. I think you have to be somebody who, has a good combination of being strategic, but also being tactical. I don't think you can, only be at the 50,000 foot level and not be able to, get your hands dirty and kind of implement projects. But at the same time, you can't be just a doer, right? You have to be able to think strategically, look at the big picture, and communicate. I think communication skills are pretty important. So I said a lot there. Kind of throw it back to you. What do you think of that?
No, I agree with a lot of what you said. Really, kind of everything. Yeah, I think it's one of those things where how do you know you're a program manager and whether or not you're any good at it? I think is always a challenge because I think a lot of it relies on experience. Um, and there's so much to being an IM program manager that I don't know if it necessarily fits into one bucket, but I think there's this perception that you need to be like this super technical IM person to be a good program manager sometimes, and I don't feel like that's the case at all. Um, I think the most important thing is that you have a plan as a program manager. What is it you're trying to do? From a strategy perspective, whatever that may be, and it could be simple. When I started out in the IAM space, I was building Lotus Notes IDs and working as just kind of like a normal account provisioner, and then it's like, oh, you know what? We should probably get something to help with password resets because that's what we seem to struggle with the most and have a lot of volume on that. And then it just kind of evolves from there and expands. So I think if you have a plan, if you've got executive support behind you to help with that, um, and being able to understand what that strategy is that you're trying to execute against, both from an IAM perspective, but also from like a security, a risk strategy, and then just from the company itself. I think it's more important to understand how the different components of IAM work together, not necessarily being a builder of those systems, but understanding how they work together and being able to um, talk through what are the benefits from a business standpoint, with different stakeholders you might have in the organization. So whether it's risk or security or the user experience improvements or, in some cases cost, things like that, being able to um, shake hands and kiss babies, right? Build those relationships, across the organization and be able to articulate, here's what we're doing and here's why it's important and here's what you're going to get out of it. When I was program managing, it was very little technical work actually on my side. It was mostly strategic. It was, managing priorities, um, making determinations as far as, what's the strategy going to be? What are we going to do now? What are we going to do down the road? Those sorts of things. So I feel like you don't have to be a technical person, super technical person, but you at least have to understand the different areas of IAM and how they work together and how to put that puzzle together for your organization. Because no organization is the same, right? Everyone's going to do it differently. You're going to have different needs, et cetera. And being able to, fit the Lego bricks or the Tetris pieces together to solve the puzzle, I think is a big part of being a good IAM program manager.
Yeah, yeah. And I think one thing that was interesting there is you were talking about the path that you took. I thought there's several different paths to get there to be an IAM program manager. Mine was quite different. I was more the techie guy. I was actually very technical. I was responsible for our entire Windows Server architecture, and then after that, I became responsible for our web DMZ. On a very technical level. And then
Mm-hmm.
I had an opportunity to do project management. My first really big project was to implement IAM. Well, that's what it turned out to be. So that was kind of a different path, and I had to learn IAM on the fly, and it happened to be an external IAM, which that's a whole other sphere, right? Which is that you've got the internal um, management of identities, and then you have external customers and B2B partners, things like that. So I think there are many paths to get there. One of the things I also kind of thought as you were talking was you obviously cared, right? A lot of people I think are like, they're doing provisioning or whatever, and they're responsible and they see the problems, but they're like, oh well, somebody else is gonna have to fix it, or I'm not empowered. But if you look at it as like this is important and you cared enough to actually try to do something about it, I think that's very important. And then knowing you for as long as I've known you, I know you have excellent communication skills. And I can imagine that for some people they struggle with communication, or that they're not really confident in communicating. And I don't think that means that you can't be a good IAM program manager, but I do think that's an area that if that is kind of one of your weaknesses, that's an area you really ought to work on, because I feel like being able to communicate your thoughts and being confident in what you have to say, it's not only important to be a good IAM program manager, but if you have aspirations in your career to kind of move up the management channel or get into consulting or really to succeed in general, I think communication is just such an important key.
You got to be able to talk good.
You need to talk good and write good.
Yeah, exactly. I think, like you said there, it's not necessarily an IAM thing, the communication side of things. That I found, as I've moved up, sort of the management chain over the years, is communications is the number one skill that aids and abets everything that you do. You can understand and be the smartest person in the world, but if you can't make that message known to other people, you're gonna have a really hard time getting anything done. So I think, you know, building those relationships and being able to be comfortable with the message you're sharing is important, and it's probably one of the most important things. And I think the only way you get comfortable with it is to truly understand how, what is it you're trying to do and why, and have, skin in the game, a passion for it or whatever, and say, hey, look, this is what we're trying to do. This is why I think it's important. Here's how these different things come together. And if you want to get more detail, we can do that. Let me bring in, so and so Jim to help me, talk about through the Windows architecture, that sort of thing. Um,
Right.
but yeah, the communication I think is such a huge component of it, and that relationship building. And I don't feel like I'm any special when it comes to communication. I feel like this is the way I talk and communicate, and the way that I interact with folks is pretty much the way I interact with folks all the time. It's not really a different personality that I'm putting out there, and maybe that's just the way that I operate. But I know that there's a lot of different communication styles that could be out there, and if you had a chance to take some of those like profiles and Myers Briggs and just the discovery ones, things like that, those can provide some insight as well. And those can be helpful, not only understanding yourself, but also how to communicate with other people as well. If you're able to, figure out, what their profile is, as far as being able to figure out the best way to communicate with them.
Yeah, I mean, self-awareness is definitely key, and I say that primarily because, especially if you're early in your career, but even if you're not, and if you're a new IAM program manager or you aspire to be one, I think knowing what you're good at and where you need work is important. So, like
Mhm.
I said, I really came out of a technical kind of background, and I realized that I needed to improve my business skills. So one of the things was I took opportunities to do project management. I find that almost any organization needs more project managers. People, and even if it's not the official title of project manager, but being able to say, I'll take something big and break it down into a plan and go from plan to execution and go live, and being able to communicate to people at 360 degrees. I think that just shows the ability to organize and basic business skills. I wanted to take it further though, because I wanted to do IAM program management, but I had a goal of moving up the management chain. Even though I realized later in my career that I ended up in the consulting space and I loved it. It was like I wouldn't want to change, but I realized that I needed to work on that area. So I actually signed up for business classes. I already had my bachelor's degree, so I signed up for an MBA program at Rutgers. It took me 6 years to get it, but it was funny because when I started that program, I said to myself, if I could just sign up and get this piece of paper, I probably would do it. But by the end of that 6 year program, and it was tough. During that time, I got married, I had kids, and my whole life changed, and I'm going to night school. So that was a lot of work, but I realized I learned so much and really understood how the business worked, and had some opportunities. One of the other things I say I've been in the IAM industry since 2003, and I have, but I've also done some projects and managed other areas of information technology. So I spent some time doing ERP. I ran a project management office, and I think all those I think again, kind of going back to what is the basis of a good IAM program manager, I think being well rounded and having experiences outside of IAM, not just being like, I went to school, I got an IAM degree, and now I'm doing IAM and spend the next 20 years of your career doing IAM because when, especially when we're doing our consulting engagements, it's like our topics go back and forth between, CRM systems and accounting systems. And, the discussions kind of touch on all these different areas where you can't be blind to how a business operates. So I think having that background, I also think, on the technology side, if that is it happens to be your weak area, you really need to figure out how to sharpen the saw when it comes to the technology. And as I mentioned, one of my favorite areas is YouTube. You watch a YouTube video, you can tell within a few minutes whether or not it's at the right level for you, and if it's explaining things at a level that you can understand and absorb, and hopefully relate back to areas where you do have some experience.
Yeah, I think YouTube is a big help. I mean, it's obviously more of a recent development. I think, we both started around the same time, around 2003 or so in the IAM space specifically. And I don't think that there was YouTube back then. So a lot of it was, reading on the web and, trying to put pieces together and, searching for papers and stuff like that. But yeah, I
Conferences.
think experience, yeah, conferences definitely. I think experience is a great teacher too. I mean, we've both taken very different paths to kind of get where we're at today. And for me, experience was probably my biggest teacher, and having some really good managers and directors throughout the course of my careers that I could learn from as well. And see what works, see what didn't work, and just really kind of observe how things progressed as we went through different programs and projects and different things like that. So
I think you
I
touched on
think
another thing earlier that I thought was like spot on, which is like kind of the having the confidence to surround yourself with people who are smarter than you, or at least know their areas way better than you. I've talked to folks in the past who are in the IAM program manager role, and they're intimidated working with other people in their organization because they feel like, oh, those people are just, more advanced than me. And I feel like to be successful, you've got to put the good of the organization and the good of the effort ahead of your own, desires for personal advancement. If you do that enough times throughout your career, you're going to end up winning.
plus you're going to learn from those folks too. But I think it's also an expectation thing that as you take on bigger roles in an organization, you're typically not going to be the person doing it. And the success of your program, project, whatever it may be, is going to be directly related to the people that are on your team actually executing against the strategy and the vision that was out there. So, um, you know, surrounding yourself with smarter people is always a good idea. Sometimes it can be a hit to the ego, right? If it's not handled correctly, because you certainly don't want to be in a position where um, there's an uncomfortableness from a way that information is getting shared. But I know I'm a big fan of bring the best team, best people you put together, and learn from those folks, no matter where they're at, up and down the hierarchy of the program or the organization. Because that's
Yeah.
just going to make, like you said, everyone better, but it's also going to help you out too, because no one knows everything, and
I
you
feel
need
like
experts.
I feel like another thing, just kind of thinking back on my own path, I was talking about how I was, this really hands-on technical person. I kind of shifted from that to I was an IAM program manager. In the course of less than a year, I went from running our DMZ server environment, which is Windows and Linux, to being an IAM program manager and implementing IAM for all of our external facing websites. And I remember kind of in that transition period, my manager was saying, we need to do this, that, and the other. And I was like, I've got to upgrade, 40 servers this week. And he's like, can't you find, another person on my team? Couldn't they do it? Well, not really. And the problem was I didn't want to give that up. It was hard. It's like
Mhm.
I had to kind of eventually get to the level of being secure to say, I'm going to take a chance. I'm going to step out on the ice, hopefully not fall through, and I'm going to give up what I've been doing, which was maintaining the servers. And there was like a certain um, level of security, is like a security blanket of managing that environment because I said, you know, hey, I'm very important to the organization because I know managing these systems is, critical. At the same time, I wasn't giving myself the time, or I wasn't really secure kind of going out into that new world. And he said, where do you see yourself 5 years down the road? And I saw myself getting into management. He's like, you think getting into management, you're still going to be managing these servers? It was really
Right.
good. I thought about it. I'm not saying it happened overnight, but eventually I gave up those responsibilities, and there was somebody else who stepped right into that role and took it over. And that was fine. And that gave me the opportunity to grow, give somebody else the opportunity to step into something new. And, so I would encourage people that, if you're in that position where it's like you've got to give up some of what you've got now to take on something new, that you've got to pick your spots, but um, you're not going to be able to do both, right? You're not going to be able to maintain the servers and run the program.
Yeah, at least not do it effectively, right? I mean,
Yeah.
something's going to give, especially as you get more responsibilities on either side of things. And it's funny you bring that up because I think we're going to talk a little bit about biggest mistakes that we've made in our IAM careers, and you sparked something that made me think of one of the mistakes that I didn't have on my list here already. So that'll be a teaser coming up. What else makes for a good IAM program manager? I'm thinking also like in an environment, being able to make mistakes and correct them, I think is an important part. And, part of it is being able to be comfortable enough to make those mistakes, because I think sometimes there's a lot of organizations where, one wrong move and you're in trouble or you're out. Nothing goes 100% perfectly every time. So if you're in an environment where, your management and your executives are supporting, here's the decisions that you're making and here's why you made them, as long as you're using logic around those that make sense. If something doesn't go right, being able to have the opportunity to shift and correct and refocus or refactor wherever it may be, I think is an important part too.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think you're bringing up something, which is that, if you're in an organization where you're not in the environment where you're feeling secure, stepping out on the ice, it might not be the right decision. But the bigger question might be, are you at the right organization for you? Are you somewhere where you're going to be able to grow your career?
Yeah, because you can be the best IAM program manager in the world, and if you don't have the right components around you to enable that success, you're still going to fail. So,
Hmm.
I think the right time, right organization, right people is a big part of it.
Absolutely.
All right. Anything else you think that makes a good IAM program manager?
I think it's one of those things also. I was thinking this as I was contemplating I am program manager. When, when you see that person, you kind of know like that person will make a good I am program manager. To me, it kind of comes back to a lot of the basics. Usually, the person who makes a good I am program manager is they have good communication skills and they care. So I think those are probably the two most fundamental things, and then technical skills and business skills can be built up along the way. But you've really got to care, you've got to be maybe not passionate about it, but you've got to at least care about something, probably the well-being of the organization. And when people see that you care and that you're going to go the extra mile, I feel like you're going to get chances, people are going to support you and try to make you successful.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like when we walk into some of our clients, by the time we're done, I feel like I already know who's going to be a good program manager there and where that responsibility should lie, just based on a few weeks of working with folks and seeing how they work as part of the project and the team and communicate and be part of that process. So, unfortunately, I think, at least from my perspective, I've seen a lot of really smart, great people through my travels over the last few years in consulting, and um, there's a lot of opportunity out there for program management if people are interested in that sort of thing.
Yeah. And I would say also, if there's anybody out there who's listening who they're saying that just me, I need more help, but we didn't maybe touch on some of the things. Reach out to us. I
Yeah.
know I'd be willing to take a phone call. It's not like we have millions of listeners. I'm going to get inundated with phone calls. So if somebody out there wants to talk to Jeff or I, we'd love to help you.
Yeah, you can always email us at questions@identityatthecenter.com, and Jim and I read all those that come through, and we're constantly getting back in touch with folks as they reach out, and trying to make the IAM world, a better place, and kind of move forward from that. All right, I think we've beaten that topic pretty much up as well as it should be. Why don't we take a quick break and kind of reset and refactor, and when we come back, we'll talk about the biggest IAM mistakes that we've made in our careers, and some of the IAM mistakes that we see others making, other organizations, et cetera, when it comes to getting the needle to move forward from an IAM perspective. All right, we'll be right back. The show will be right back. Don't forget, you can email us at questions@identityatthecenter.com. All right, we're back. Let's talk through some of the biggest mistakes that we've made in our IAM career. I'm going to go first because you had me thinking about this one, and this is in no particular order, but when you're talking about giving up earlier, the responsibilities of doing different things, I think that's one of the big mistakes that I made early on in my career, was not having a replacement ready to go, or in a position where they would be able to step up and take over my role, which I felt like it limited my ability to be promoted within an organization. So, um, being able to train and educate and have others be able to step into your role, I think, is an important part if you're interested in moving up in the organization, because it makes it a lot easier to say, okay, well, we can't afford to promote Jeff because he's too valuable here and there's no one that can step into his role, versus, oh yeah, Jeff would be a great pick and we have someone that can slide right into his role relatively easily. Let's go ahead and move it forward. So that was kind of one of the things that I teased earlier, that I think, from a mistake perspective, I would, if I didn't have the experience now, I'd go back and do that over again. What about
I
you?
think that's a good one. Well, I mean, just to add to that, I was kind of sharing my story about how I transitioned out, and I actually was fortunate that I had an awesome resource to hand things off to, somebody who I hired, um, and he stepped into that role and was at least as good at it, if not better than me. And he went on in his career, and now he's doing some really cool stuff. So, I mean, not that this relates to IAM, but he's with this company that builds sports arenas and sports stadiums. So with like the new stadium they're building out in Vegas, I think he's got two projects, one in Vegas and one in LA, where he's putting in all the IT for these big stadiums, including the humongous monitors and screens that they have. But it's like, the guy took off, and I knew he had skills. So giving that area up was less about whether or not he could handle it. It was more about whether or not I was ready to give it up. And I finally did, and it was the right move.
Yeah. Trying to think some of the other things of mistakes. Some things that are a little more tactical at the time. I remember getting into um, battle might be a strong word, but let's go with it. Battles with IT teams as far as, what's the tool that we're going to use from an access catalog perspective? Is it going to be the ticketing system, or is it going to be the capability that I have in my IGA platform, for example? I remember having many discussions around that, and I don't know if there's necessarily a right answer still in my mind, but I remember having many discussions with help desk teams and other IT infrastructure teams as far as, okay, well, where are we going to put all these requests for people who want to do self-service access, those sorts of things. So I think that was a little more tactical, but I remember having too many conversations around that.
Right, right. I think I was thinking about this question. It's like, I don't really have regrets because I'm exactly where I want to be in my career. I love what I do. I'm passionate about it, and I feel like I've got the right work-life balance. But just kind of reiterate, I guess, because I talked about this already, was I was really deep in IAM, and I took other opportunities within my company at the time. This is going back 15 years, but I ran a project management office. I ran a team implementing ERP and actually doing that in Europe. So I was like doing all kinds of cool stuff. And then I got back into security because I was wanting to transition from the company I was at and get into banking. And that was, one of the things about IAM, and I think this is good career advice for anybody. I think starting as a generalist and getting a good understanding of a domain like IT, or like infrastructure, even more specific, like infrastructure or development or something like that, I think is a great way to start your career. But I think if you want to, especially if you want to build a career as a subject matter expert, it's to refine around a specific area and kind of the more tightly focused. If you get in an industry like IM, and I feel really fortunate to have those early IM experiences because I think this is an industry that hasn't been just homogenized. Like, where I originally started was with server administration. It's like all that is as a lot of that has been outsourced. So had I taken the natural path, I might have ended up in a data center and punching a clock, and that wouldn't be kind of the career that I wanted. I wanted to be something more dynamic that would leverage kind of my natural skill set and communication, developing strategies and things like that. So I feel very fortunate to have ended up in IAM, but I kind of feel like over time where a good career strategy would be to find an area to specialize in. I think identity and access management is a great area to specialize in. So I don't feel like I've made a mistake in terms of career path. Um, I One thing I was going to also point out was okay, so now I'm in consulting. I've been with Identity for 8 years. So I ran two major IAM programs prior to coming to Identity, and then I went into consulting. And my first two projects, and who knows who's listening, people from those organizations, but those first two clients were universities, very large universities. I'm not going to say who they were, but I had I was in for kind of a rude awakening in terms of how much I knew because I felt like I had a pretty good understanding of how IAM worked. So I stepped in these universities and they were using, technology like Shibboleth and Grouper. And even though I went to universities, I thought I understood how they worked, but I really didn't. And man, it was like truly drinking from a fire hydrant. And I felt like that for a few years after getting into IAM consulting was like, my goodness, it feels like, you know, overload in terms of all this stuff that I don't understand. But, you know, you have to kind of go through that uncomfortable period, I think. So that was kind of my learning was,
Hmm.
going through that uncomfortable, um, kind of lack of comfort and just, putting yourself out there and learning new stuff. At the same time, the industry's changing underneath your feet. So I'd say within probably the last 4 years, probably the first 3 or 4 years, with a lot of growing pains like that. And then I kind of started to feel a lot more confident. Whereas today, I kind of feel very confident in this space. I know I don't know everything, not even close. And, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. I think that's very true paradigm. But I do feel like even the stuff that I don't know, I'm not afraid to ask anymore, and can pretty much go into any industry, and I don't feel like I need to know everything walking in the door because I do know what I know. I know the basis of what how to manage who has access to what. I know kind of the industry solutions, and I can kind of figure out the rest. And I can lean on, even more important to that, I know who to lean on when I don't know something, and who to touch base with, and get how they can help me. I'm not threatened by the fact that I don't know something. I can kind of reach out to people who are experts in that area.
You've come to arrive to be at peace with your strengths and weaknesses, and I feel that's important part of it too. I felt the same way moving into consulting was, I thought I knew, enough. And then when I made the switch to consulting, it was the same thing where, the expectation is that you're sometimes, from the client side is that you're an expert on everything, which I don't think is necessarily realistic. But as you do more engagements and you see how other organizations do things, that just adds, I think, to your body of knowledge when it comes to being able to, um, understand what will and won't work and some of the things to look out for. Because a lot of consulting is based on experience, and when you work for one company, you see how they do it, so you become trapped in the context of that organization. So these are the tools we use. This is what I know. This is what I know works and doesn't work for our organization. But if you expand that out into 10 organizations a year, 20 organizations a year, whatever it is that we work on from a client perspective, you start to see a much broader picture of the space, and ways to solve issues at one company that you may have seen somewhere else. I think that's probably the biggest thing that I've seen, just making the jump from working for big organizations and then moving into consulting roles. So I certainly agree with that, for sure.
Yeah, and the kind of consulting we do is, it, I think it's kind of unique, right? You're parachuting in for a couple of months, and you're going to develop the IAM strategy for an entire enterprise, and that's pretty challenging. It's pretty daunting task. And we've done it so many times. It's like I'm not even intimidated by it anymore. But sometimes we bring other folks in from our organization to help us, and I mean, these are people with just as much experience in IM as you and I have, and they're usually brighter in one area or another. Usually, the technology, somebody who has got a development background or has been implementing IGA or access management for a decade or more, and so, but they're kind of intimidated by the idea of kind of the operating model we use, which is that we kind of go in and we're a blank slate in the beginning and learning about the organization. And one of the things I tell people is that you you can't be intimidated to ask questions. Like if you don't know something, don't sit there and pretend you know it, or be afraid to ask the question. Now, every once in a while, you're going to ask a really stupid question like, "What's Workday?" Like, okay, like you don't even know what Workday is. But what if?
Everyone knows that's Monday through Friday, Jim. Jeez.
Yes, yes, it's 9 to 5, and then you go and live your life. No, but like so many times I go into organizations, they're talking about a system that they call something like Workday, and it's like, I'm just going to ask. I don't even, and you find out it's some custom database that they built. If you're afraid to ask the question, you're sitting there thinking, all right, it must be, I'm going to search the web and find out what it is. You've got to find the right balance, right? You don't want to go in there and sound like a total doofus. But at the same time, if you're afraid to ask questions about things you don't know, you're going to lose. And then if you lose, the client loses, right? They're not going to get the a very well thought out strategy. So I take the chance of looking stupid sometimes, and sometimes I do. But if I don't know something, I'm going to ask the question. I think that's something I've learned, is that it's better to take a risk and potentially look like you don't have the experience. Usually, it's like if I did. Usually with me, it's that I didn't hear it properly. Right? It's like we didn't say workday, we said work O'Shea or something like that. You're like, oh, okay. Yeah, I definitely don't know what that is. Oh, really? What is work O'Shea? No, we said workday. Oh, okay. But yeah, I feel like that's something that um, one of the things on the consulting side, you have to be confident enough in yourself that if you don't know something, you're going to ask the question.
What about companies today? What are some of the IM mistakes that you see them making?
I again, we work on strategy, so I think the biggest mistake is that um, usually when they're calling us is because we have X, Y, and Z problem. We're not able to do kind of these basic blocking and tackling moves that we have to do, or we're the focus. I think the big mistake is like if the focus is on just solving the current problems, because the industry is moving so fast that if you solve those current problems and it takes you 2 years to solve them, the end of that 2 years you're gonna have all new problems because the landscape is changing. I mean, who was thinking about DevOps 5 years ago? Or even 3 years ago, a lot fewer organizations were using things like Kubernetes. And
Hmm.
so that's one of the things that it's one of the things that I try to do with my clients is to get them thinking about those things. And if they're not using those things, it's like, well, don't you think in a couple of years you're going to be? And so I think that that's one of the biggest problems is if you're thinking about the here and now and not thinking about all the trends that are happening and being prepared for the future. I think that is a mistake that I see a lot. What about you?
I think the biggest one that I see, and the one that concerns me the most, is an organization not doing anything, right? Even they may not have a program, or they just don't see the benefit to doing it, so they just kind of sit there and don't do anything. Or even after we've come through and built out this great strategy and everyone kind of agrees to it, and then they sit on it for like a year. So it's not like things are going to get better. So I think in my mind the biggest mistake company can do is to just not do anything at all, right? They just say,
Right.
okay, well, we're gonna, the price tag we saw was too expensive, or whatever the reason is. Typically it's funding related, and so we're just going to push that and kick that can down the curb. It's not like things are going to get
Yeah.
better or cheaper, the longer you wait. So,
Well, usually they
I,
got into that position because they've underinvested
mhm,
um, over a period of time, right? So they're already extreme laggards in security, and now they're trying to do all these things that IT, they're doing things like DevOps, and the IAM program is like not even doing basic blocking and tackling. So
right,
now you need to make a very big investment just to get caught up. So I think under investing in IAM, or like you said, not doing anything is a big problem. And then I think a lot of times where we'll meet with clients and work with clients is like you get to a kind of a solution state. You're talking about a solution state where you would be doing it right, and they say, "Oh, we'll never spend the money on that." It's like
hmm,
that becomes the reason not to do anything. Is like, oh, cost, cost, cost,
yep,
and you know what? It's that's what's going to cost more, a data breach or investing in the right technology?
right. And you're going to spend that money anyway, right? It's whether you're going to do it now for this price, or 2 years or 3 years from now at a higher price, most likely, because you've just it continued to accumulate, more bad habits and more things. And on top of that, you've increased the risk, like you said, of a breach. Um, so I think
Nope.
I think some of it is organizations always trying to figure out, well, what's the cost benefit for IAM technology? If me investing in IGA isn't going to save me money, then I'm not going to do it, for example, right? I don't, that used to be the way that I think people looked at it, especially when you were looking at just password resets and things like that. Cause I know that's what we looked at, when I was
Yeah.
just getting started. But I think it's changed now to more of, risk mitigation and user experience and all these other things. So, in addition to not doing anything, is when they see that price tag to do something, they start to try to figure out, well, how do I justify this, and how do I show this is saving money, when in actuality it's a lot harder to determine. I think these days, especially when you start to go up against kind of like soft benefits, right? Well, what is a turnaround time worth to an organization if they want to remove access in a timely manner,
Yeah,
or
we talked about
provision
we
access when they first start in an organization?
we talked about what makes a good IAM program manager, somebody who can explain that, who can talk about risk, somebody who understands that side of the business as well. I remember
Mhm.
early in my IAM career, someone saying to me, "Fine, how many people can I fire?" And it was like we had put together a whole business case on all this time that people were spending doing IAM tasks and how it was distributed around the business, and people were spending like 3 hours a week here and there, and I kind of and they said, well, that's soft savings. I know it's soft savings, but that's really what IT does, is it makes the organization more efficient. That's why we all carry laptops. 20 years ago, it's kind of like, well, if I give laptops to everybody, how much money is that going to save me? Could you imagine the world today without without these basic pieces of technology? It makes us so much more efficient, and security is like that. um, I think another thing that I had for this question was um, trust. And we're in this world where one of the big popular IAM frameworks now is zero trust. The idea that you can't just build the crunchy shell with the soft center and be secure with that. But I just the name, zero trust. I work with a lot of organizations where they say, well, we only have 10 domain administrators and we trust them. Especially when you talk to the person who manages them, it's like, I manage them. They're all, kind of good people. And, if they leave, I'll lock out all their accounts. And it's just like, I think that is a very flawed way of looking at security, especially identity management. I think you have to get into a world where it doesn't come down to trust. It just comes down to good security practices, and we're going to make sure that um, people don't know the password to machine accounts and things like that, and that we're not vulnerable if that person goes haywire or just decides that they're going to hack the company if they are separated from the organization or something like that. So um, yeah, I feel like, that's one thing that we run into almost everywhere we go is that certain people are trusted. And unfortunately, those are usually the people that have the keys to the kingdom. And I,
Mhm.
I feel like a lot of times for when I start working with a client where the biggest thing that jumps out at me is that, they have a number of insiders who really could, cause a lot of harm to the organization. And I say, that's the biggest problem that needs to be addressed. And they have their focus on, well, single sign on or identity governance. And those things are very important as well. But for me, like locking up the keys to the kingdom, there's nothing more important than that.
Yeah, trust implies an acceptance of risk in my mind. Whatever it is, it could be a big risk, little risk, doesn't matter. Trust just it's assuming you're assuming risk. So I think that's an important one to think about the level of risk. And if you've got people with privileged access and you trust them, great. That's a lot of trust to give someone who could basically bring down your entire network, either because they did it or because someone got a hold of their account. So it's not necessarily about the individual, but the hygiene around how they're protecting those accounts as well.
I
It's
think
just
you've made
that's
a fantastic point there. And when you're talking about accepting risk, who is accepting the risk? The IAM program manager, the
right.
the person who manages these people. It's not their job. Their job's not to accept that kind of risk. And I think, and maybe in a very very small organization, but I think that's a very good approach. Is identifying areas of risk and making sure that they are accepted and that they are communicated properly to the right people within the organization. And that's the one of the central themes I think of a lot of our strategies is having good governance. I'm not talking about identity governance, but good program governance to
Mhm.
make sure that the right stakeholders are involved with the IAM program, that the right decisions are being made by the right people. And so if an organization doesn't have a framework built around that. They don't have a steering committee. If they don't have stakeholder involvement at the appropriate level, then they run the risk of when something goes down that the right people weren't involved and they just wash their hands of it, and the IAM program gets a big black eye.
Yeah, exactly. What else? Any other mistakes that you want to bring up that you see companies making or organizations making?
And I feel like the biggest mistakes that I see are the same things that you'd see in almost any other um, area of IT. Things like not having executive sponsorship. I think, kind of not looking at IAM as an opportunity, especially when you go into a new, updating your IAM strategy or moving to a new system, trying to copy the processes that you have today, not looking at it as an opportunity to re-engineer things to a set of best practices. Um, those are things that I used to see in my ERP days, which was, hey, this is how we do a purchase order, and we're getting a new ERP system, and the ERP system has to do purchase orders the way we do them. Well, what if we flipped that on its head and it said, this is how the ERP system does purchase orders. Can you do it that way? And if not, can we minimize the amount of customization so that we basically work within the quote unquote best practices that that system has together. And whether or not you like that practice, I'm going to tell you, if you decide to change the system up for every single practice that you do differently, you're going to spend a lot of money to customize the system. It's going to be very hard to maintain over time.
Yeah, that's a good one. I think the other thing too, along with that technology, is keeping that technology upgraded and updated to the latest versions. Because you can have the best technology in the world, but if you don't keep up with it from a maintenance perspective, you're probably going to hate it in 2 to 3 years and think it's not effective. So keeping your tools updated is an important one too, that I see sometimes companies make mistakes on.
Yeah, I mean, we might want to do a separate podcast. We got that really cool slide in our pre-sales deck, which is, based on a blog that was written by Frank V. Like 10 years ago, and we've updated it since then. But it was the 10 biggest mistake or 10 pitfalls of an IAM program, and it goes through 10. And we've been talking about some of them, but it's kind of a classic. And you look at our blog statistics, and it's one of the ones that still gets the most hits because
Exactly.
everybody's like, how do we avoid, you know, failing? And I will say, like, when I got involved in this industry, um, IAM projects were failing at a clip of over 50%. And part of it was that the technology wasn't as good or easy to use as it is today. But a lot of it was these pitfalls that people kept running into, customizing systems and trying to get them to work the way the manual processes work. And so we should go over that sometime.
Yeah, it's probably a good topic for one that we can build a show around. All right. Well, I think we're in a pretty good spot to kind of leave it for this week. Anything else you want to bring up, Jim?
Just happy New Year to everybody, and I wish everyone the best. We've been talking about careers and running IAM programs, and I hope everybody has a great year in terms of achieving their personal goals and achieving their goals for their employers.
Well said. And with that, welcome to 2020. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you in the next one. You've been listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. For more episodes, visit identityatthecenter.com.